Okay, so I was talking, Maureen, last hour about government being out of money and yet still promising too much. But what happens when the opposite is true? When the government has too much money sitting around? And that's pretty much what you've been writing about, it seems to me, in your past couple of articles.
That's right. What's going on right now here in Wyoming is that the governor has presented his supplemental budget recommendation. And typically what happens in this cycle, sort of, is that we have this consensus revenue estimating group, which is a group of other government people who get together and they kind of try to figure out, they're economists and mathematicians and this sort of thing, and they try to figure out how much money the state can expect to generate over the next couple of years, 2 years typically we have here. And what has happened is that this group, they're called the Craig for short, they have said, well, hey, you know what's happened is that we think that the amount of money that we put aside for the general fund for the 2015-2016 biennium, so for the next 2 years, is actually going to be about $4.4 million shorter or smaller than what we thought it was. So what that has done essentially is put the government into, or put the governor in particular into spin mode, because he's saying, well, you know, it's not that we're going to actually be short of money, because you know what? We've got all this money hanging around in a state like Wyoming, which is a state like Alaska, any of these kinds of states and provinces in Canada also that have got lots of revenue from resource development. What happens is you get a ton of revenue, and the government, even in its spendthrift ways, couldn't possibly spend it all in 1 year. So they squirrel it away in these different kinds of savings accounts. What's happened over time here in Wyoming is that those savings accounts have grown tremendously, and the governor himself has said, you know, what I have tried to do, and this was a good thing, right? So governors can sometimes do good things. What I've tried to do is actually reduce the increase in spending over the last couple of years, and so as a result, we still have got quite a bit of resource revenue coming in to the state coffers, but the amount of spending has sort of moderated from the previous 10 years when it was just going up massively every single year. So now what he's seeing is the consensus revenue estimating group saying, well, look, I think, you know, you need to actually spend even less maybe than what we had said before. And the governor's saying, well, no, you know what? We've got these rainy day funds. We've got all this money squirreled away. Let's spend that instead. Because, hey, when are we going to spend it? When are we going to have a rainy day? You know, it's like we just put our umbrella up and away we go. And the reality, too, is that we do have quite a bit of money saved up in savings accounts, but if the governor thinks that the rainy day funds are overflowing, what he should be doing is closing off the downspout. And what I'm saying here is what he should do instead of spending that money, he should cut taxes and leave the money in the pockets of the people who earned it so they can make their own spending and saving decisions.
Well, there's an interesting concept that you and I will understand, but you know, a governor doesn't tend to understand. So, okay, let me visualize it for people. So, if you had a farm, Maureen, you would have a big water tank over your farm for various reasons, including dry spells. Once the water tank is full, it's full. So, why not just take the big rainy day fund that we have, cap it off as full, and start giving the money back? Essentially, that's what you're saying.
Well, there are two things really. One is that's not exactly what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we're not going to put any more money into it, because what the state in fact does, and this is a good thing, and you know other states do this as well, is that they generate revenue from these funds. I mean, for instance, we've got about $16 billion saved in what they call permanent accounts. And that's something that a lot of people have heard who pay any attention to government at all. One of those is called the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, and there's a Permanent Land Fund. Those are the two biggest of those funds, and those are constitutionally protected, and that means that the government can't raid those funds unless there's a constitutional amendment. Now, the investment returns from the fund goes into state spending and also goes into state savings accounts. It's actually quite a complicated flow. Now that totaled about, so the amount of money that those funds generated totaled about $812 million in 2014. So in one sense, the governor is right. The state's collecting too much money. But what is he really talking about doing? Well, he can't raid the permanent funds because those are constitutionally protected. But what he wants to do is raid the funds that aren't constitutionally protected. So instead of reducing spending, he still wants to spend actually $156 million more by raiding these rainy day funds. What here in Wyoming, the rainy day fund, when people talk about the rainy day fund, what they're talking about is, in fact, this something called the Legislative Stabilization Reserve Account, or LSRA. It's bad for acronyms, really, really bad for acronyms here. And that fund actually has about $2 billion just sort of sitting in it, generating revenue, a little bit of revenue anyway. And as he said in his speech, that's doubled during his time in office. But instead of spending that money, he really should be cutting taxes instead. I mean, you don't want to spend the fund that you have for a rainy day on pet projects. You want to save that because we live in a state, like any kind of resource-oriented state, that is extremely cyclical in its revenues. Because and we know that anybody who has gone to the gas station lately or has looked at oil prices, we know that oil prices are falling. We already know that natural gas prices are low. We know that the federal government has got a war on coal. That means that anybody who's looking out beyond the next election can see that we might be in for a real rainy day. Which is, a rainy day up till the governor decided he was going to ask what that meant, always meant an unexpected economic downturn. You know that's going to come because we live in a state with a cyclical economy. So we don't want to spend all that money. We want to just now start not collecting anymore, and what we want the governor to do is actually start cutting taxes.
Would you say that cutting taxes, especially in targeted areas, if you will, would actually spur economic growth and keep us away from a rainy day?
Yeah, well, certainly it's going to put more money in the pockets of the people who earned it, and people are always better at spending their own money than a bureaucrat spending somebody else's money. That's absolutely true. So if people have more money in their pocket, and in fact, this is one of the discussions we hear all the time with this fall in oil prices. That means the gasoline price is going to go down, and that means people are going to have more money in their pocket. That means they're going to have more money to spend. It's the exact same thing. If you reduce the sales tax, people are going to have more money in their pockets. They're going to have more money to either spend, but not necessarily spend. They might actually save that, and they might actually invest that in ways that are much, much wiser than the ways that government will tend to spend on. We can to invest in, and we can talk about that in a second. So one of the things that we're suggesting is a permanent cut, if not elimination, of Wyoming's sales tax. So that's because the largest single source of money picked from the pockets of Wyoming taxpayers for the general fund, and that's the main spending account for the government, is something called the sales and use tax. And that's a lot of money, too, because during the 2013-14 biennium, the sales and use tax deposited about $1 billion into the general fund, and that was up just a little bit from the previous biennium. And still now for 2015-2016, although this may change because of falling oil prices, this consensus revenue estimating group is expecting that to go up to about $1.1 billion. Now, if the government cut the sales tax, that again would leave more money in the pockets of taxpayers, and they could make their own savings decisions. And that's certainly, I think, something the government needs to start looking at. Well,
and here again, it would encourage people, I would think, to come shopping in places like Wyoming. And by the way, we're not the only state that doesn't have a sales tax. Isn't Montana a state without a sales tax?
Yeah, I'm not too sure. I'd have to look at the list. I'm a little bit more up on which ones don't have income tax.
Yeah, I believe that's the case, that Montana doesn't have a sales tax. But anyway, yeah, I think that would bring even more tourism into the area. Okay, so here, let me just toss this out. We've heard a lot of complaints about Wyoming roads, mostly from, the people who have to maintain the roads, and a lot of debate about raising taxes to pay for repairing the roads. So why don't we just use funds to repair the roads if we have a bit of excess?
Well, this is one of the things that the governor is, in fact, talking about. He's talking about spending an additional $21.2 $2 million, in fact, on a highway you might know, and that's the Highway 59 between Douglas and Gillette. And he actually, he justifies this expenditure by saying nearly twice as many people died on Wyoming highways in 2014 compared to 2013. The problem, there are a lot of problems with this argument. I mean, certainly dying in a car crash is terrible, but is that really what he wants to do on that highway is build passing lanes, but is that really what the problem is in Wyoming or anywhere else for that matter? And the other thing, of course, too, is don't forget we're paying more sales tax to the government, more gas tax to the government. So, and that's about close to $50 million a year, and that goes into road maintenance. So the highway department is already getting more money for road maintenance. And what the governor is saying is now we need to build new roads, or not new roads exactly, but new lanes, because so many people are dying. But this is actually a fallacious argument. I took a pretty close look at this because I knew I'd be talking to you today, and you're in Gillette. Building those passing lanes is actually going to it's not even probably going to put a dent in highway fatalities on that road in particular. And if we look at I actually called the Wyoming Highway Patrol and got some fantastic stats from a very, very, very helpful fellow. Because, of course, the conclusion that I'm going to come to is the same one that he has. And so if we take a look at the stats, it's in 2013 there were 75 fatal crashes that killed 87 people across the state of Wyoming. Now, 87 deaths is terrible, except that was a historically low number. Now, to December 5th, 2014, 126 fatal crashes killed 145 people, according to the data that I received from the Highway Patrol. Now, again, let's put that into a broader context, because the governor is saying, "Ooh, these, deaths are way up." Well, in fact, the only reason deaths were way up, is because they were way down last year. 2014 showed a continuous downward trend in the number of fatalities from crashes in Wyoming. Now, if you look at actually the number of fatalities in years past, in 2006, 195 people died on Wyoming highways. So, he's misusing the stats if he's saying really 2014 is a big increase over 2013, when in fact 2013 was historically low.
Well, and not to get you off on too much of a subject, we do have a break coming up right here, but being in this area, there's a boom going on right now in Douglas, and there's a lot going on at the mines. So traffic, especially with big trucks and heavy equipment, has really picked up on Highway 59. So I have heard the argument, hey, we need to maybe just 4-lane the whole thing and make that a major artery because it would be good economically if we did so. I've heard that argument.
Okay, but that's an entirely different argument.
True.
I mean, what he's saying is that we're going to build this stuff and it's going to reduce deaths. But that, you look at the data, and that's just not going to be the case.
Back we go with Maureen Bader from Wyoming Liberty Group. So, okay, Maureen, of course we are not saying that it's not a good thing that the state has squirreled away so much money. But now that they've squirreled away so much money, what exactly that you do? And I still haven't heard a really good definition, except maybe a little bit from you, about what is a rainy day exactly? When do you finally dip into the fund?
Well, for a lot of the legislators that were here in the mid-1980s, they know what a rainy day is. And so I'm looking to them to prevent or to stop the governor from actually raiding these funds. And I think enough people are aware of what the governor is up to, and enough people understand that this is we're in a state with a cyclical economy, that we don't want to just blow the cash out the door on stuff that's going to on stuff. We want to keep that in there for a true rainy day. In the meanwhile, let's just cut some other taxes. But if we want to go back for a second to the situation on Highway 59 and why building passing lanes is not going to do anything, if you take a look at some of the U.S. National Highway Safety Traffic Safety Administration data, what it shows is that fewer people are dying on American highways now, not because the government is spending more money on highways, but because of human behavior. It's lower alcohol consumption, higher seatbelt use, and better vehicle technology like anti-locking brakes. And this is interesting, and I know this is going to sound like sacrilege here in this state, but actually it's also because of less driving. So one of the reasons I kind of clued into this is because when I was living in Canada, I was with the Ministry of Energy, Mines, and Petroleum Resources, so it's like the mining department of the provincial government. And one of the things that we had up there was a big increase in the number of deaths in the oil and gas production industry, which is in the northern part of the province. And the reason for that was not because there was anything wrong with the roads. It was because you've got these young guys who have made a lot of money, who have been drinking, who maybe are tired, and they drive off the road. And I thought, I wonder if that's the same thing here. Well, when I called the Highway Patrol, he actually confirmed that the most frequent victim in a highway fatality is a young male not wearing a seatbelt who has often been drinking. And in fact, if you start looking at the data, I got a whole big spreadsheet from this guy. He said that alcohol is a major factor in Wyoming highway fatalities. In 2013, 26 of the 75 fatal crashes, or 35%, were alcohol-related. And so far in 2014, 32% of highway fatalities were alcohol-related. That compares to 36% last year and 41% in 2009. And in fact, we can see even here in Wyoming, alcohol-related fatalities are trending downwards. Now, another very important factor in highway fatalities is seatbelt use. And the lack of seatbelt use is a major factor in highway deaths here. 55% of fatalities so far this year involve people who were not wearing seatbelts. Now, this is kind of interesting, too. Another reason that overall fatality trend is on a downward swing here in Wyoming, maybe because, according to the Department of Workforce Services, the number of young drivers fell by 23.5% between 2000 and 2013, which is a much higher rate than the 9.8 reduction in the youth population. Now, so far in 2014, people under 21 make up about 11% of fatalities. So we got to ask ourselves, are people crashing on Highway 59 because there are no passing lanes, which is what the governor wants to spend $21.2 million on? Well, if you look at that data exactly for that highway, so far in 2014, there have been 8 fatalities on Highway 59. 4 of those involved alcohol, and of those 4 people were not wearing seatbelts. And some of these are a little bit complicated because one was a multi-vehicle accident, and this is just crazy. This is really actually anger-inducing. The drunk driver who was wearing a seatbelt, he lived, but the passenger in the other car who wasn't wearing a seatbelt died. So in a non-alcohol-related fatality, fatigue was a factor. And there was another one, too, just north of Gillette, where you had 3 guys in a van sort of fell asleep at the wheel. And these were oil and gas workers. They rolled off the highway, and then the 3 guys got killed. So, as the Wyoming Highway Patrol says, it's up to drivers to make good decisions when they get behind the wheel. So when you drive, I hate to sound like a school marm here, but you can wear that seatbelt and don't drink and drive.
Right.
You want to reduce highway fatalities, and this is trending downwards on its own. People need to not drink and drive and always wear your seatbelt.
Okay. Well, Maureen, you've written a couple of articles about this that you've sent to me. Where do people find your articles, and where do they find Wyoming Liberty Group?
Yeah, please go to wyliberty.org. I've got the 2 budget articles up there now. I'll have another couple next week, and we'll maybe talk again next week because the Appropriations Committee is meeting, and we'll talk about more dumb investment ideas that the governor has then.
Oh, that's going to be fun. Thanks, Maureen.
Hey, thank you. Bye now.